It is an extreme honor to be here just to celebrate the Emeritus College with you. And special thanks have to go to John Buga, who was the mentor to the college and to me, and helped me get the Heilbronn Award, which then I was able to turn into a grant application for a Templeton Award, which has kept me busy in England the last 3 years. I've continued to have this, academia is a dirty business, but somebody's got to do it. So I've had to go to England each and every summer. And I don't fly because I have Meniere's disease, so I have to go on the ship. Oh, Queen Mary 2 is just awful. Awful, awful. What I want to do two things today. I want to try to explain to you why I've studied something for a half a century, and hopefully you can understand why it's kept my interest. And I also want to open you up to the idea of how you can use the support that the Emeritus College gives you to turn it into something else. And that was the transition both up to the Heilbronn and then to the Templeton. So I want to take you through the steps that I did for that award. Okay. All the work that I do is centered around relationships. For my whole life, I've tried to study what makes relationships work. I think some of it comes from the fact, I'm just realizing it as I say it now, that my mother and father, who were married for 63 years, how they stayed together, I have no idea. They shouldn't have been together, but they were, and it's been a mystery I've been trying to unravel. And some people are very good at relationships and some people aren't. When I was in the college full time, this was the model I used, but you wouldn't recognize it because I had all kinds of arrows going different ways, so that it was almost obfuscated because you couldn't just put this up and say, please give me my salary. But this is really what I did. All relationships go through a process of choice, beginning, deepening, and ending. And then they cycle into another choice phase. And this model is helpful in the sense that it tells you sort of how relationships go. And the fact is that the earlier in this process you have problems, the more devastating the effects. So that people who have problems at the choice and beginning of relationships, they're the kind of people that we have psychological disorders like autism, schizophrenia, depression to talk about. These are people that don't even choose to relate or don't know how to begin relationships. We all have problems. We can have more problems in deepening relationships. How do you get from a friendship, from a beginning, hi, how are you, to friends? That's a huge step, and one that children, if you can't do it as children, it's going to be hard for you to do it as adults. And so I've worked with kids a lot to try to get them to learn how to go from beginning to deepening. We all have problems ending relationships that we all share. Of course, we've all ended one set of relationships when we retired. And I've talked to people who are thinking about retiring. I have an idea about how to make that process work well for you. But the end of a relationship is really important because it's the only time in the relationship process when you can look back over what you did to know what you did right and what you did wrong, so that you could then choose to begin your next set of relationships better. So I see the end of a relationship, and I believe that relationships go through predictable endings and unpredictable endings through our whole lifetime. I'm sort of in the midst right now. This is my 8th year after retiring, and I can feel myself moving into another transition. I'm not as comfortable doing what I did before. It's good stuff, but I'm wondering, should I keep doing it? Should I change? And I'm open to that process going for the next year or so. And I want to leave time for whatever might be bubbling up next for me to appear so I can sample it and try to do that. And if you look back over your life, you'll find that process has been going on your whole lifetime. I think the single most important personality characteristic determining if we're successful at relationships is something called locus of control. I also think we as researchers or clinicians or whatever it is that we do, whatever we teach, there's something implicit in what we spend our life doing that's part of our personality. I was born in the inner city of Milwaukee, which, by the way, is having its schools closed tomorrow. That never happens. Why? Because it's so damn cold. That's why I'm here. But I was born in a place where when I look back over it, my friends, some of my relatives, didn't make it to adulthood, or if they made it to adulthood, had problems of all different kinds. And I kind of made it out of that environment. They'd call it resilience or whatever term they use for people they can't predict that they should have. Resilience is another way of talking about error variance, because these are people that sort of did something that they shouldn't have done. We can't predict them. They should have problems. They should have difficulties. They shouldn't be successful, but they are. Okay? And so I've always wondered why that happened. How did I make it? And most of my friends and colleagues that I knew at that time hadn't. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I think I was talking about something called locus of control that was introduced by a man by the name of Julian Roeder in 1966. He introduced this idea as part of his social learning theory. I was in graduate school at this time. I learned a little bit about it. This is what it isn't. It is not locus of control. I often get things from entomologists saying, well, that's interesting because we're studying, but I'd like to know how the locust moves. Locus of control simply is the degree to which we expect what happens to us, good or bad, is connected to our behavior. Okay? Do we see a connection between what we do and what happens to us? If we do, more often than not, we're seen as internally controlled. Connection between outcomes and our behavior, internal. If we, for the most part, don't see connections between our actions and what happens to us, externally controlled. Okay? Connection between our behavior and outcomes, lack of a connection. Locus of control is not a dichotomy. I'll talk about it shorthand as a dichotomy, but I want you to keep in mind that it is a continuum, going from mostly internal at one end, mixture of internal, external at that end, and most of us will fall in the middle with a tendency to be more internal or more external. Basic facts about locus. By the way, anytime you have questions, please raise your hand, because I would love to get across to you what I think may be important things to you individually. So there's only one way to be internal. There's only one way to see a connection between what you do and what happens to you. There's multiple ways to be external. It can be luck, it could be fate, chance, powerful others. There are many quotes for externality, many quotes for internality. These are some that I gathered. I have about 100 of each. Amor fati, love your fate, which is in fact your life, Nietzsche. Oh, I am fortune's fool, Shakespeare. Whatever is going to happen will happen whether we worry or not, Anna. These are different views of externality. Quotes for internality. It's a little hard to read. Shallow men believe in luck. Strong men believe in cause and effect. Emerson. Luck is a dividend of sweat. The more you sweat, the luckier you get. Ray Kroc. Luck has nothing to do with it because I've spent many, many hours, countless hours on the court working for my one moment in time, not knowing when it will come. Serena Williams. Okay? So these, you got a feeling for what internals and externals view things? Basic facts about locus of control. It is not a trait. It's not a trait of, like aggression's a trait, or you have this kind of trait or that kind of trait. Personality theorists are fond of having traits, and you measure the traits and they're the same thing across situations. It is an expectancy. It is an expectancy that your behavior will or will not be associated with an outcome for it to come. Because it is an expectancy, and a generalized expectancy, one that's generally how do you approach a problem situation. You have a problem. As soon as you have a problem, as soon as that is triggered in you, it triggers your locus of control. Will you approach that problem with the idea, I'm going to be able to do certain things to solve that problem? Or do you figure, luck, fate, chance, doesn't matter quite what I do, it'll get solved. Either somebody else will solve it, or it'll just pass, and I'll accept it one way or another. So it has its greatest impact in situations that are novel, ambiguous, transitional, or stressful. All right? That to me is retirement. All four of those. All four of those. And so, but any place where you run into a situation that's new, that you haven't had experience before, you can't fall back on a specific expectancy for what's going to happen. It's a generalized expectancy. It will trigger your locus of control, and you will approach it, solving that problem in a particular way. Okay? Any questions about that? Basic fact about locus of control, 17,865. That's how many studies have been published on locus of control as of 2016. Marshall Duke and I, he spent a lot of time, Marshall Duke's my best friend, he's never retiring. I talk to him every week about retiring, and he won't retire. But one article that we wrote, he went and found out how many articles were written about locus of control. That's what's true in 2016, and it has shown no sign of abating. 17,865 studies. Basic facts about locus of control. I don't know if you can see the bottom here. Relationship between locus of control and age. Uh-oh. 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 Become more internal with age. More internal. Childhood, middle adulthood. Ooh. We get to, what should I call us? Mature age. And it turns, becomes more external, which is appropriate. I can't, as much as I would love to hit a one-hand backhand down the line off a really hard serve, I can't do that anymore. If that person serves the ball to me at a particular speed, at a pure rate, I say, good shot. Okay? I don't have the control. So the fact that this turns is a reflection of reality. As we, especially children, grow, they get more and more internal with age. What is important about this score in older people is the fact that even within that group of people who, in general, might be more external, the more internal you are, will be associated with a certain set of outcomes compared to how external you are. Okay? And I'll show you some of the things associated with internality and externality, and you can choose to see whether you'd like to be internal or external. Okay, basic facts about locus of control. Internals have a better time of it in life than externals. How much better? Compared to their external peers, internals live on average 7 years longer. So if you want to squeeze a couple more years out, we can talk about becoming more internal. Even though internals and externals do not differ in IQ scores, internals achieve more academically than externals. This fact is the single, when Roeder published his article in 1966 introducing locus of control as a psychological construct, a study was published by Coleman et al. Of the first major study of African American and white children in America and their achievement. In that study, they asked had a 3-item test that they gave. And what they found was that the single most non-cognitive factor that was associated with achievement, number 1 for African Americans, was being internally uncontrolled on those 3 questions. And that immediately gave locus of control some merit. The study was on 500,000 kids, yeah.
To what extent does the outcome determine
cause and effect?
Internal or external viewpoint?
Cause and effect, you mean?
If you have a good outcome, you may say, well, it's because what I did.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a bad outcome, you may say, well, couldn't help.
And who do we know that might fit that? I've never met you before. Yes, of course. That's known as defensive externality. Take credit for the good stuff, not the bad stuff. There are tests that can parse for that and see how much effect it is. It's a way of defending your self-esteem. Take credit for the good. Don't take any credit for the bad. Works for some people for hopefully a short amount of time. How internals differ from externals. Internals are less anxious, less depressed, higher self-esteem, less impulsive, less aggressive, less alienated, less pessimistic, more disclosing, more reflective, less helpless, less likely to be addicted to drugs and alcohol. And that's just the start. I mean, there are literally hundreds of characteristics where internals turn out to be more positive than externals in personality. Social, internals are invariably more popular, more respected, more satisfied with life, more likely to be leaders than followers. I teach now in the business school. That was part of my gig, that when I got done with the college, the folks at the business school said, well, now that you're done there, why don't you come and give a talk to our club about what you're studying? And I went and gave a talk to the club, and Andrea Hirscheider, who was the academic dean, undergraduate dean, said, that's just what our undergraduates need. Have you thought about teaching a course to business students? I obviously said, no, never had. And she said, well, why don't you do that? And so for the last 7 years, that's what I've been doing. I teach a course to second semester seniors in the business school. It's a capstone course in which locus of control becomes one of the major areas, and it's called psychology of leadership, because that's what business schools do. Everybody in the business school is a leader. Nobody follows. They just lead. Hundreds and thousands of leaders, but no followers. And there's a great deal I'll share a bit of the business data with you, but locus of control has just been discovered by the business community. And they found out that, whoa, if their managers are more internal, if their CEOs are more internal, we make more money because they're better leaders. Here's some data from that. Meta-analysis of 184 studies concluded that internality is related to greater job satisfaction and performance than externality. So that's music to the business school's ears. This is a massive study that was done by Vermeer, analyzed 267,000 observations from 84 countries, and based on this analysis concluded, if I were going to choose which variables predict life satisfaction, my money would certainly go on locus of control and freedom. And the putting together of the locus of control and freedom is going to be a key to what happened with the Heilbronn grant and the Templeton Foundation. Locus of control and a satisfactory retirement. What do you think? The single most consistent factor for predicting whether your retirement will be satisfactory or not is not short-term or long-term, although there are nuances with that. It's not this or that. The single most important characteristic is whether you felt you were in control of the decision. Study after study after study. If you think you were forced to do it, not satisfied. If you did it on your terms, it was short-term, long-term, however, more satisfied. Okay?
And I mentioned, of course we're more satisfied when we retire because we have the time that we didn't have when we were before.
Yeah. Not everybody, though, likes that time. Okay, so think about this as a master variable, locus of control. And why changing locus of control, I know it's hard to see. Locus of control is powerful because it's in the center of all achievement, self-esteem, persistence. You change locus of control and you change everything. It's like a kaleidoscope. Get a little more internal and all that shifts. So you achieve more, you have better chance to make relationships work, you have more persistence and so on. So what I've been focused on is trying to find out how locus of control develops and how to change it. Okay, so how do internals gain their advantage over externals? The big five. I named that myself. And you know why? Because there's five. One, they take responsibility for what they've done. I did it wrong. I must have done something wrong. I take responsibility for it. Two, they are persistent in their efforts. Why? Because they believe they can figure out a way to solve this problem. That's why they keep working at it. Three, they can delay gratification. They trust themselves to wait. I'll take, and the studies that have done this have done the delay of gratification where you get one thing now or more things later. Which would you take? Externals will invariably choose the one thing now because they don't know what the future is going to bring. Internals feel they can control a bit to make things happen so they can wait for the things to come. Savings, trying to save money, etc., etc. Internals are information gatherers. They are the Hoover of information. Everywhere they go, direct, indirect information, they're constantly picking it up, keeping it because you never know. They're the Trivial Pursuit mavens because they know all the details about what song Smokey Robinson sang in 1962. Luckily, it comes and trivia works it out. I can come up with stuff. I'm very good at this. I'm internal, by the way. I have information that nobody else has. And it'll come up, and I'll just say, well, yes, the answer to that. And people will look at me and say, well, why is that in your brain when you can't remember where your keys are? But it's there. And I continue to do that to the present day. And they resist coercion. This is in the book, by the way, that makes great bar mitzvah, first Holy Communion presents or birthday presents. It's something everybody would want. I gave a talk in the 70s in Hungary. I was invited by Maria Rupp to talk to the Hungarian Psychological Association about locus of control. And it was in the days with the communist regime, and I took a train from Vienna over to Budapest, and the change going over on the train, I think maybe some of you had that same experience. Austria was having the elections, and there were coffee houses and people, and you crossed the line, and the guys came with the guns, iron bars, pushing them underneath the seats to see nobody was carrying anything in, and Budapest, a beautiful city, but it was just run down and awful. And Maria Rupp and I were going out, and they assigned me a guide. Wherever I went, there was this guide having coffee with us and stuff. And, one day at a time, the guide sort of had to do something and got a little further away. And I turned to Maria and I said, Maria, why would a communist regime write to try to have me come and talk to them about locus of control? I mean, internals resist coercion. And she said, no, they're not interested in how to make internals. They're interested in how to make externals. So they're going to take everything that you say about internality and they're going to find an anathema for it, for externality, which is interesting. So if you want to build a country that's going to resist dictatorships, internality. But I have some concerning news for you. After all this good news about locus of control internality, and here it is. What's happened to our internality? There's been 30 years of consistent change in locus of control in our country, but in an external direction. We have become more and more external in the last 30 years. And the chart goes like this. I forget, I have a lot of graphs. Your chances of what was an, see, how does this work? Your internal score today would have been at 40% of the time would have been an external score 30 years ago. The whole distribution has moved toward externality. Yeah.
At what age are you measuring it?
This is both in children and adults. The study that there's a meta-analysis, and they went through all of the studies and dissertations that were available over the 30 years, and they computed an average over each year.
So how early is it? I mean, is it known how early this?
The externality changes. It begins that we can measure locus of control consistently at 6, and so it's all and we actually did a study at Emory because we at the time I was working with Tom Johnson, who some of you may remember, physical education department. They had a health class, and we gathered locus of control information each year from that class. And I said to myself, well, Emory is becoming more and more the premier college, university in the world. Come on, I mean, we'll take a look at that and we'll show the rest of the country maybe getting more external, but Emory students. And the curve was steeper toward externality. And you know that. And you know that from your teaching. You know that you can't just say, go and solve this problem yourself. How am I supposed to do it? And then if the students, I don't know how it was for you when you finished teaching, but I was getting so many more phone calls from parents telling me, how could my son or daughter get a B in this course? And I said, because that's what they got on the test. And they said, well, then you must be a bad teacher. My students bad. Yeah.
This might be a time to make a comment about executive function,
Mm-hmm.
or regularly taught in the schools now. What is the relation of executive function to this?
Save that question for the end, because it's. I'm going to say.
Yeah.
I'm going to say how. I'm going to suggest how one can teach what you need to have in order to develop internality, appropriate internality. Is there another question? Yeah.
I assume that most of the studies are done in the U.S. Something like this, where you see an increase in externality, does that apply in other countries as well?
Yes, and there hasn't been this massive a study. I mean, they looked at the 50,000 adults and 60,000 kids. So nothing like that, but Germany, certainly France, the Western European countries. Some cultures are more faith-based than others, and so they'll start at a different place. But why? Just an aside, I don't know. I hope this is to the point that it's useful. I have a lot, and I teach in the business school, there's a lot of students from Eastern countries. There's from India, Mid-Eastern, India, and other places that have culture-based, collectivistic cultures. And the idea is that, well, then that means, because internality is related to being better managers in business. They find that a lot of, in the States especially. They said, well, in a collectivist culture, that wouldn't be true. So they did a massive study of 36 countries, locus of control of managers in 36 countries, collectivistic, individualistic, whatever. And internality still predicts better managers. It's what the people do with their internality that makes them better managers. In collectivistic countries, they use it for the group. Whatever information they get brings glory to the group. In the United States, it's glory to me. Then whatever trickles down to the other people. But it's still how you use your internality to solve the problem that you have of managing. That's the key. Okay? Here's else, just, I'm not saying this is cause and effect, but these are the other things that have been happening over the 30 years that we've had a country becoming more external. There's been a tenfold increase in diagnosed depression. A person now has a 10 times more likely chance to be diagnosed with depression than they did 30 years ago. And that's not just because we're better at picking it up. It's not just because we're more open with our what depression is. It's just increased, period. As the suicide rates are now beginning to show you. Obesity rates have doubled in adults and tripled in children. I'll get to the study in LSPAC. The percentage of eligible voters who have actually voted has decreased for each federal election except for one, 2008, when Obama ran. Otherwise, it's been going down, down. Academic achievement has declined to the point that achievement tests have been renormed lower. So what's expected in a fifth grader now is less than what was expected with a fifth grader before. They say, are you working up to your grade potential? The grade potential has been low. Okay? So now we're successful. So, where's the information we need to respond effectively to the problem of disappearing internality? This was something I became aware of when the study was published about us becoming more external, though I had a feeling about it. Unfortunately, the information we need cannot be found in the 17,000 completed study. Why? And this is the old story about, the guy who lost his wallet, and he's looking for the wallet underneath this light. And the guy says, what happened? He says, well, I lost my wallet. And he says, well, where did you lose it? And he says, over there in the dark. So why are you looking for it here? It's easier. Okay? I got more light, I can see. Same thing with this. Locus of control has been studied over and over and over again. Sort of the low-hanging fruit has been gathered and published and published and published. So the information you need is this kind of information. You need longitudinal or prospective studies. Studies that take individuals over time and follow them. That tells us how locus of control operates within an individual when they're this age, and when they're this age, and when they're this age. Not cross-sectional, comparing 50-year-olds with 25-year-olds, but the 50-year-olds have experienced an entirely different set of circumstances than the present 25-year-olds. Studies revealing the origins of locus of control. Where does it come from? How does this happen that there are people who are internal or external? And studies revealing what brings about changes in locus of control. In other words, how do you change locus of control? And is that related to outcomes for those people and those people they are around? Now we come to Danville. At Danville, LSPAC. Any questions about that as we lead up to that? No? Where can we find the kind of information I'm really interested in? LSPAC is a longitudinal study of parents and children. What does LSPAC have that's not been done previously? Well, I'll read these to you. It's very small, but I think this is important. They've assessed the control, locus of control of fathers as well as mothers prenatally in a large representative population. How representative? All the children born in the city of Bristol in the years 1991 and 1992. 25,000 children. They've gathered data on the impact of prenatal parent locus of control on child outcomes. It assessed the locus of control of parents and their children with a similar test. And you know what test they used? What do you think? My test. Yeah, they used my test of locus of control. Yeah, how about that for falling into it? I do believe in luck. But I was there when they were trying to decide what tests they were going to use. I was around. I did hang around. I did buy lots of cups of coffee. So it assessed with a similar test, because that's how you sometimes they use there's a test for adults and there's a test for kids. You don't know how the two relate to each other because they're different tests. They assess locus of control at different developmental ages for children and adults. So at different ages, question is, what's locus of control when the child's 6, 10, 15, 20? What about the parents? What are they going through when they're 25, 30, 40, 50, 60? Use both parents and outside observers and objective data to assess child outcomes. It wasn't the same way of measuring outcomes all the time. They used the parents sometimes, they used teachers sometimes, they used objective test information sometimes. And they gathered data on both the psychological and physical outcomes of children over time. That to me was a gold mine. I was around Bristol, as I went there as a research fellow. I knew the study was going on. I was retired. Now I'll read this to you. This is just a guide for me. I was retired and I had time to do something. And I really wanted to find out about locus of control. So what did I do? Well, I knew LSPAC had this tremendous data, but how could I get to it? Because the English, have any of you done research with English universities, Great Britain? They keep things pretty much to themselves, don't they? Yes, they'll tell you about their work, but not necessarily they're going to open their hearts to you. So what I did is with John Booga's help, he helped me how to write the proposal, and I used part of my Heidelberg grant that I got to obtain a sample of data that I could analyze. So I asked them for a small part of locus of control data to analyze. After analyzing the data, I asked, as the head of the project, I'd come and visit. If I was going to be able to get a grant to study these data, I had to go to the people face to face. Because they would not just, my email isn't going to do it. You have to be there, you have to talk to them. The relationship part of it then comes into it. The internality part comes into it. I met with the people. I showed them the data. I was invited to give a talk. I gave a talk on the data. I met all interested partners. And I said to them, if I got a grant, would you give me access to the data? And they said, sure, as long as we control it. That's good enough for me. That's okay. I just wanted to get to the data. I didn't care if we publish, and we publish almost everything together. So I returned back to the States with that possibility and wrote the Templeton Foundation. Have any of you done any work with the Templeton Foundation? Anybody? Grants or anything with it? They are a very unique group. Templeton was a very unique individual. His history is really, really interesting. And his foundation wants to study the big questions. God, freedom. And, he's willing to give you money. And the process of getting the money is that you write a 3-page proposal that says, here's what I want to do and why it relates to what the Templeton is interested in, answering the big question. Remember the study that I talked to you about that said the number one predictor of work satisfaction and a satisfactory life and work success is locus of control and freedom. I decided to say to the Templeton Foundation, I think locus of control is a measure of freedom. How can you possibly be free if you don't have choice? And internality says, I have a choice. I can do this or this. This will have that outcome, and that will have that outcome. So let me analyze. Let me do a study on that. And here's this data sitting there waiting for me. They then, if they like the 3-page, they will then ask you for a full grant application. About 10% of the 3-pagers get one. We got one. We got the grant. 3-year study. And that's what I've been doing things. But I could not have done it without the hybrid. That was the key because it got me, number one, it got me the fact that I had a grant from someplace, so I could come to them and I could come to Templeton and say, somebody has thought enough of what I was thinking about doing so that they gave me this fellowship. And if we then, I can then use this to get to something else and get the rest of the data and answer the question of freedom. Any questions about that process? It's one that if you're interested in following up and doing something like that, they fund all different kinds of people from all different parts of areas of knowledge and expertise. And they're willing to talk to you about anything. It was the nicest. I tried to get an NIMH grant when I was in college, and they were just nasty. They could give you no time of day, no help, change requirements, weekly. Templeton was a very nice thing. So what they have in the Templeton grant that we have, and I want to talk to you briefly about, and then I'll stop, was we looked at the measurement of parents' locus of control before the child was born. There were no data on this anywhere. They would get the locus of control of the parent when the child was 1, 6. There are some studies that looked at parents and children, testing them at both places, but once again with different tests. And what we had was that we could look at the parent's locus of control before the child was born, so that we did not see the effect of the child on the parent. This was the parent coming into it. Would that play any part in child outcomes to follow?
Is this before the mother got impregnated?
They're pregnant. She's pregnant. This is before the child's born, usually about anywhere from 3 to 4 months before the child's born. And then from the mother, too. So we got both parents. We have 25,000 kids, 25,000 fathers, 25,000 mothers. Yes? In 80% of the cases. 74%. 74%. First study. Very quickly, I could go on about these studies forever. We looked at the prenatal parent externality and child outcomes before age of 5. 4 weeks into the child's birth, differences are appearing in sleeping and eating. The kids don't sleep as well if the parents are external. Their sleeping is spasmodic. They don't eat properly. They eat fitfully. Emotionality, more upsets, more difficulties, more. From 4 weeks, we have measures from 4 weeks up through 5 years of age, showing that what the locus of control of the parent is before the child is born is predicting that outcome, those outcomes. Okay? But of course, the one criticism immediately is that the parents are making these judgments. Maybe it's just externals are more likely to see negative things in their kids and say that they're more negative than internal parents, although that's not true. So next study we did, prenatal parent externality and children's school adjustment. What we did is we took what the locus of control of the parents were before the child was born, and we looked at the kids at 8 and 10 years of age. Only this time, their outcomes were rated by teachers. Greater parent externality generally, the greater likelihood that the children will be rated by teachers as having personal and social problems. This is 8 and 10 years past the measure of the prenatal locus of control. It's having an effect a decade later. And what we found is that mothers and fathers' externality had differential outcomes on the children's adjustment depending on the kind of difficulty the child was having. Father's externality was related to the children having difficulties acting out. Mother's externality was related to the children's difficulty with internalizing disorders, anxiety and depression. So we're getting the difference here. Parent externality for fathers and mothers is having differential effects on the kids. How consistent are locus of controls over time? There was no study up to this one that actually looked at the same individuals over any amount of time. The longest was 6 months. Here, we have, this is that locus of control tests were given to the parents prenatally before the kids were born. Both parents and kids took it again. Well, the kids took it for the first time. Parents took it again when the kids were 8 and again when they were 16. And the question was, how stable is locus of control? If it's completely stable over time, no changes over time, then it's like a trait. Then there's not much we can do about it. I was looking for there to be some stability, but also a lot of change going on. And so we found that in essence, over time, they're related, correlated about 0.50. Yes.
Just wondering, how much is this? Is there any way of teasing out what is genetic and what is environmental?
Ooh, yes and no. They globally looked at the guy that's the epidemiologist that's in charge of this whole thing is internationally renowned, and he looked at the genetic contribution to locus of control and found there wasn't any. I mean, I don't know what he did, to be honest with you. I don't follow, I'm not up on genetics. There may still be some, I'm sure, in terms of determining temperament and that kind of thing. We haven't teased that out. Okay, but it still may be something. Yeah.
How do you explain in the prenatal association if there's no genetic information? There's no environmental prenatal.
I mean between the parents' prenatal locus of control and when they took it 8 years later?
Yeah.
That's what it was when, I don't understand.
Well, from what I'm hearing, a lot of this locus of control seems to be environmental.
I'm going to argue that it's learned. Yes. Yeah. And that what happened, what this says, because for the first time we now know what the stability of your locus of control. We tend to stay the same. Children especially, children are less likely to stay the same. It's a little bit lower for children going from 8 to 16. But adults appear to stay the same, but some changes are going on. Something's happening. Yes?
What kind of changes did you see in families where there are 3 or 4 children and with the parents? I mean, so much different.
Okay, here's where I don't know. They statistically controlled for that, for the change. And the correlation stayed somewhat the same regardless of the number of children in the family. But so I haven't looked at that as maybe as detailed. I certainly am going to do it. I'm going to say in the next grant, I'm going to look really closely at that if they give me another grant. Yes.
It seems like some external factors are hard to overcome. And for example, your zip code determines what your educational opportunities are. Or there's actually been studies where kids are born during a famine, i.e. they have poor nutrition in their perinatal lives. counts throughout their entire life.
Well, in fact, they're doing a study in this right now where they're looking at the children of the children. And they're finding out that if the grandparent had difficulty eating prenatally and so forth, the parents don't necessarily pick it up, but the grandchildren do. So there is something going on there. I'm not quite sure what it is. I'm not saying, to me, the only perfectly internal people are in asylums. They think they can control everything. They control plane crashes. They control. So it's learning. It's a good question. It's learning what the appropriate amount of internality you have for the situation you're in. Okay? So the difficulty with the zip code, because my zip code said I should never be a college professor, let alone go to college. So something happened in my environment that allowed me to think I had some control over what I was doing to make it turn out differently than my friends. So I think it's some combination both of a recognition of the physical kinds of constraints and your perception of what you can and cannot do and how accurate that is. Okay, yeah, Brad? Oops, sorry.
Just a minute. I'm going to get the microphone to people because we can hear people just fine within the room, but with the webcast, they won't be able to hear your questions.
Okay, all right. Brad, you're on.
Thanks, Steve. Steve, as a psychologist, you are using the term locus of control as a psychological variable, but it sounds to me like it's equally viable as a sociological variable that's measuring life chances, socioeconomic circumstances. Have you ever thought of integrating a sociologist or a social scientist into your study that would study the relationship between the social setting in which these families are living and the way in which that impacts their sense of locus of control?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We control for that statistically. We take SES, control for that. We control for what we can in this study. And again, because it has all of these data on the background of the kids and the families, there's lots of things we can control for. But yeah, to have somebody take a look at the broader picture, I have a bias in the sense that I think this is a perception of the contingencies that are in your life. And the more aware you are of the contingencies between what you do and what happens to you, the more appropriate and better your locus of control will be, the more internal you'll be. There are people that let me put it this way. I think, I'm trying to make sense out of the election that took place with Trump. And I even wrote some op-eds to sort of try to explain what I was thinking of. With our country becoming more external, externals, when they run into a problem, say, I don't know what to do with it, they take chances. Well, I'll try this. Nothing else worked, I'll try this. And I think the fact that people will be feeling more and more external and powerless, that they said, I'll take a chance on this, with Trump. And you hear people say, well, now that I've seen him, I now have some data to make some sense out of what I'm doing. Maybe I'm hoping they will make a more accurate reading of what they want out of this man and what he can do for them. Externality precedes government takeovers, people powerless. In order to have a fully functioning democracy, you have to have an internal population. You have to have people that feel that their behavior has something to do with outcomes. When that starts disappearing, democracy goes away. So that's why I'm sort of fully invested in trying to get, not everybody internal, they can, it's not the answer to all life's problems, but internals ask questions. You got to convince an internal. Just don't take my word for it. So everything won't work. Okay? All right? Almost done here. What's associated with parents changing from externality to internal? So now with this idea going on that we know prenatal locus of control is related to these outcomes, what's associated with parents changing from externally? What is making parents become, are there things in our population that going from the prenatal, going from this to this, which parents became more external over time? Which parents over this 8 years became more internal? What led to those changes? And we looked at what we had available to us, and the answer is support. Measured a lot of different ways. And the single most prominent factor that led individual parents to be moved from externality, prenatally, to internality at 8 years later, and what led parents who were internal prenatally moved toward externality was satisfaction with their relationships. Be it a spouse, be it a family member, be it a relationship with work, financial support had something to do with it as well. But the more people felt supported, the more likely it was that they felt internally controlled. And they changed from being external to internal. And this is nice. I mean, it shows that I now know what changes, but does that have any effect on the children that we're talking about? If parents change from one kind of locus of control to another, is that translated into children's outcomes? So the final study I want to talk to you about is, do changes in parent locus of control relate to children's behavioral outcomes as rated by school teachers? We took all the parents. We took the groups that were changing from state were external or became external over those 8 years. Parents that were internal, prenatally internal, and changed to external over those 8 years, stayed the same internality. And we found out that when parents moved toward externality over the 8 years, their children's ratings in school got worse. As parents became more external, the children became more personally and socially maladjusted. The ones that became more internal, the kids got better. So it's not exactly cause and effect, but it suggests that there is this association between parents, locus of control, and changing it. And so, I mean, the take-home message for me, I'll finish up with some of this other stuff, but what it says to me is I next want to have another grant. I may be asking the Heilbronn Foundation for another. By the way, Al Heilbronn was my mentor here when I was at Emory, which is just a lovely thing to have happen. He and I argued with each other for 30 years about how to do personality research, and to have his fellowship be something I'm using is just a lovely thing. But what I want to try to do, now that I know this, is I want to do studies where I go actively and I know how to change parent locus of control prenatally. Get in there ahead of the birth of the child. Change the parent, provide one set of parents with particular kinds of activities and interventions, compare them with another group of parents that we don't do that, and see what happens to the kids. Okay? But this is the take-home message. The way we perceive the connection between what we do and what happens to us has much to do with how successful we are in our personal, social, and workplace interactions. Getting back to relationships again. The key to learning about internality, or your locus of control, is awareness of the match between our actual locus of control and the control available in problem-solving situations is crucial for successful problem solving in our personal, social, and workplace environments. You need to know your locus of control. If you're very, very internal and you're in a place where there is really not much you can do, if you are acting like there is, it's going to give you a lot of grief. You're going to feel poor about yourself. It's going to have personal consequences for you. You need to accurately read how much your internality can play a role in solving the particular problem you have. In the recession that took place in the early 90s or middle 90s. I had people coming to me, men and women who worked hard and couldn't find jobs and were terribly, they felt guilty and awful, and they came to me for psychotherapy. And my therapeutic response to them was, you shouldn't feel guilty because there are no jobs. No matter what you did, you aren't going to find a job. They ain't there. So it's supportive in a sense. The other side of that, of course, is if you're too external, you're going to have things you could do to make your life better, and you're not doing them because you're not looking for them. And so for external people, you have to open them up to the fact that here's what's available to you. Internals, you have to say, don't be too internal. Like Tiger Woods, for instance, who went crazy with his internality, thought he could control everything in the world, and it fell apart on him. So that it's appropriate internality and appropriate externality. And lastly, since locus of control is learned, it's possible to change our orientation at any time during our life by learning to be more aware of what does and does not impact on what happens to us. It's learned at home first, and then it's modified by our life experiences as we move through life. And let me stop there and see if there's any questions. Okay? Well, wait, she's got it.
Thank you, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
Using my locus of control, I've changed my question.
Okay, excellent. That's what you do, change with experience.
Okay. We are associated with an educational institution. And we get the children of these parents. A lot of what you've emphasized here is what appears to be in cause from parents' internality or externality, causing a certain kind of internalization or externalization in the children. So that raises questions for the educational process. One of the things I can think of is parents are often concerned about sending their children to an institution where the children themselves become too independent if the parents really are strongly in control. I remember a parent telling me, well, she went to university there, but fortunately, I don't think they were able to make her worse. She has come back and she still is the same good girl she was. And that girl never really achieved what she should have achieved. So what, and liberal arts colleges regularly have celebrated the way in which they have led their students to independent thinking, critical thinking, and often they take their parents through a journey of having to accept their change.
Yeah, okay, keep in mind that the rate of change toward externality is as high in college. So you're dealing with externally controlled kids. And you can become externally controlled by two ways. One is that you, no matter what you do, something good happens. Okay? You crash your bike, that's okay, we'll buy you another bike. You did it, that's okay, we did that. So no matter what you do, something good happens. Or no matter what you do, something bad happens. If I have a choice, I'd rather have the good. But I mean, you're going to learn it both ways. Or you are responded to randomly. One time you do this thing, you get rewarded. Next time you do it, you're punished. Those are ways that children learn to be adults. They have to learn contingencies through their parents at first. If you do this, this happens. Which means parents have to allow the children, and this is the model that I think we should use as a liberal arts college, to make mistakes and to learn from mistakes. Not devastating mistakes, don't let them crawl out into traffic and get run over, but if you have them do things where they have an opportunity to fail. You have to fail to develop internality. There's no other way to do it. You got to learn what you can and can't do. And you have to provide support when that failure takes place so that the people, the kids, can process the information they've learned. If it's too anxiety-provoking and terrifying, they won't process the connection. So what you have to do is provide in college or at home a situation, an environment where a child is given freedom to do things, to learn about the outcomes of their different behaviors. However you want to construct that is what I think you need to do to develop appropriate internality.
Yeah, I have two questions actually. One is about, I like the way you talked about it as expectancy, because one of the features that I would expect on this list of 5 would be the ability to anticipate, the ability to imagine things going wrong before they can happen. You know, I mean, if you just let it happen, then they will. But if you think ahead, you know, then you're more likely to be successful as an internal. The other thing is that it goes back to maybe Brad's question, the social and the individual. It seems to me that if you have a parent who is too external, that would lead you to see, to maybe to respond, I don't want to be like that. You know, I mean, there are often family traits of people that you know well, that you say, well, I don't want to fall into that trap. So I was a little surprised about the fact that the externality of the parent translated so strongly into the externality of the child.
Well, no, it didn't do the externality of the child. It turned out to be the outcome. Because here's something that deserves another grant. The correlation between parent locus of control and child locus of control is 0, or close to 0.
Say that again?
The correlation between parent locus of control and child locus of control is about 0.10, which is close to 0. So that but a parent externality is related to child outcomes.
Could you explain that more? I interpret it the way I just read it, you know, that why would you copy your parents if you see they're unsuccessful and too external? But so what do you mean then by the outcome?
Whether they are more anxious, whether they act out in their behavior, whether they achieve more, whether they become obese at certain ages, those are child outcomes. The outcome is the behavior of the child, whether it's positive or negative. The more external the parents are, the more negative the outcomes are in the children.
Yeah, that I can understand. Yeah.
Okay?
But that doesn't mean that the child is not trying to be internal.
No. That's just saying parent locus of control with child outcome as measured personality-wise and how they think about themselves, their inability, their popularity with other kids, their leadership ability, their achievement. Okay. That's what that's about.
It doesn't then necessarily translate into the externality of the child.
No.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah. The model between parent locus of control and wherever the child's locus of control will be is very complex. And that we haven't uncovered yet. Yes.
A very general point. I think everybody lived long enough, and a couple generations, sees that, from my perspective, what we did as children was very unstructured relative to parenting today, where they're being very carpooled and driven and organized into teams and sports, and you know, it's very much more control, externally controlled. We were outside playing kick the can and hide and seek, and sort of left unstructured. Is that, do you think, a factor?
Yes, I do. I call it being over parented.
Yeah.
And you need the freedom to. If you kick the can and you don't make it back, you lose.
Yeah.
And the parent isn't there to say, poor child. You know, my child always has to win. Sorry.
Yeah, what you said about losing and, you know, not succeeding and having to solve it is probably the key ingredient. The other second question really is something that I've always been fascinated by is the importance of, you talk about luck and fate and chance and all of those things. children, I think, are more curious than others. And I'm wondering whether this independence in some ways might correlate with, I don't know whether it's a trait or whatever it is, but curiosity. And sort of, as that sustains through life.
I know this, internals are more curious, simply because they want to find out the lay of the land. They want, the coin of the realm for an internal is information. When they're coming to a room, they're processing who's there, who's doing what, what do I need to do? You know, and good teachers, if they see somebody beginning to fall asleep and things, they see that, they move over, they do something, you react on the basis of information.
But do you think curiosity is inborn, or is it innate and just developed or not developed?
No, I'm always going to make the mistake of thinking things are more learned than inborn. Because I don't know quite, even geneticists, I'd like to act as though children can learn no matter what. Not thinking about, well, genetically they might not be able to do this. I'd rather try first, unless we get, you know, genetic profiles that everybody wish we might get, so that we know exactly how much they can and cannot learn. I'd like to make the mistake of being, in other words, I'd like to make the mistake of being too internal rather than too external. Yeah. With the question up here too.
Along with emotional profiles, there are these social profiles, and essentially our society is changing in terms of privacy, and I wonder how such things as, for example, Facebook will not drive an entire society in which a lot of information is known about people, and therefore would cause additional forces which we've not seen up till now.
The way I make sense out of the Generation Z, they're now Generation Z, by the way. They're not millennials that you're teaching. These are Zers, they're called. And they're even more technologically oriented than millennials. And they more want work to be everything for themselves. And they are even more inept interpersonally and more external, because the forces that are out there on the technology overwhelm them, and they don't know what to do with it. And so the more, there's data that say the more Facebook friends you have, the more external you are. So it's a false internality. I'm popular, see, I've got 4,000 friends, sort of thing. So, and it's a way that they're grappling with the measure of friendship. I mean, another area that I talked to this group before earlier is nonverbal communication and so forth. And this group is, they just don't have it. They don't, because they don't interact enough with others to pick up the cues they need to know when their interactions are going well or not well. And that, of course, leads them to become more external, because they make interpersonal mistakes and they don't know they're making them. Yes.
Steve, we're living in a world where there's a lot of migration. The Iran, and for example, going into Europe, and people from South America coming into this country. If you had to test those people, those immigrants, where do you think they would be on the scale?
My Locus of Control scale?
Yeah.
Another grant. You give me another grant idea. Thank you, Jim. I'll give you a little note down here when I'm on the Queen Mary. I think they would be bimodal. I think they would be bimodal. I think you have two kinds. You have the kinds of people who, in essence, both kinds of people made America great, in the sense that there were internals that came in and nothing was going to dissuade them. They were going to do this thing, and externals who would say, I'll work any place, anytime, for anything. Just let me work. And I think that population is both. I think it would not be a normal distribution. It would be some people who are the cream of the crop in terms of internality. here's how I'm going to take care of my family, here's my plan, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And then there's others that say, I'm going to come up to the border and I'm going to sit and somebody's going to take care of me. Both kinds, very, very external, very, very internal. And I think that if you test it, you find that to be the way that they are. That's just a guess. Okay? Is that it? Any more? That's it? It's really hard waiting for the microphone, isn't it? Just feel like Phil Donahue. Remember Phil Donahue used to have a show?
Do you think there's any relationship between internal, external, and political orientation?
It turns out, believe it or not, the most internal people are white Republican males. That's just what the data are. I mean, that's all. It hasn't been studied that much, and often it turns out that there's not that much of a difference if you look at them. Again, within each party will be a bimodal distribution, I think. You have somebody who will be telling, I mean, you see how the parties fight amongst themselves, and it's a fight amongst people saying one thing and another thing, and I think some are more internal than they should be, and some are more external than they should be. It's a good question, but I don't think there's a clear answer.
I have a question about your couples. So if you have a couple, a spouse who is way on the left side of your scale,
Internal.
and say internal, and the other one is
external,
can they influence the change in their spouse? That's one question. And the other one is, do the two attract one another, or are they?
Everybody loves an internal. That's what the data show. That internals are better liked. We put internals and externals together. Maybe the internals don't rate the other person very highly, but externals always like internals. Yeah, whether they attract one another, internality seems to be. There's a group of researchers who has done a decade of studies, but these are mostly with college kids, putting internals and externals together and seeing what happens. And everybody ends up liking the internal.
So why use some internals like some externals?
Love. Yeah.
Steve, based on some of your comments, I'm curious to know if you think that from your study that locus of control might be paired to psychiatric diagnoses, particularly in the way of predictive indicators.
Yeah. Externality by far is related to all kinds of psychopathology. Externality is. Internality is in some instances, especially with psychosis and massive depression, but more often than not, the more external you are, the more likely it is. It's like almost all dimensions, is that when you get to the extremes, that's associated with maladjustment. But overall, externality seems to be related to bad outcomes.
And one more question?
Okay.
Sort of along the lines of the previous question, what if one of the parents was an internal and the other parent was an external, then looking at the outcomes of the children at 8 years and at 16 years, were there differences, or do parents tend to both be internals or externals?
Okay, I can answer that question. So please. The key thing is the more externality there is in the parents, the more negative the outcomes in the children. So if you have one external parent, it'll have a more negative outcome than if both parents were internal. Two external parents is worse than one external parent. And the deal with which parent is internal or external as to what the outcomes. We've only looked at this with the school kids at 8 and 16, and it's like mothers, if they're external, will have kids who will more likely have internalizing problems. anxiety and depression. If a father is external, more likely the kids will have acting out problems. In other words, they'll be more likely to be juvenile delinquents and temper tantrums and so on. And if you look at it even finer, you find that externality in the mother is related to the daughters. And we're especially interested, we're trying to get a measure of, looking at the measure of 12 and 13-year-olds. What's happening in the lives of 12 and 13-year-olds, because that's the age at which the difference in depression between males and females occurs. And the girls then go on to greater and greater incidence of depression, and boys do not. Starts around 12 and 13. And we're thinking it has something to do not only with externality, but the other thing that I study is nonverbal communication. And they've also used my test in LSPAC, the Danville, which measures the ability to pick up emotion in faces and voices, which I can talk to you another time about. But I think if externality is coupled with poor nonverbal accuracy, that's the thing that leads girls to become depressed more than boys. Because nonverbal communication is more important for the girls' adjustment than the boys. Okay? That it? Hey, okay, no. Thank you.